been wondering what this would look like. It's really great to be here and to be with you. It's really humbling to be in your company, actually. Let's see if I've got this right. So the thing about this talk is that I'm used to making talks that really talking about type design and the process of type design. I'm going to try to make this much more a typographer's oriented talk. I'll probably fail to some extent, but that's my attempt. But typography and type design are really two sides of the same coin. The one is not possible without the other. And the longer I'm a type designer, the more I am seeking to understand and become a better typographer in order to be a better type designer. So this is the big thing that I wanted to explain. It's very kitsch, but optical size is now automatic for variable fonts on the web. And maybe it's even been like this for 5 years. I'm not sure the exact timeline, but I discovered this recently because I'm making this new font. And I'm testing it in the web page using TypeX from Stephen Nixon. And what it lets me do is to see, down here at the small sizes, is that working? What about here? What about there? At each of the sizes, because it automatically deploys the correct optical size, I can see what is it doing. And it allows me to work faster and to be more satisfied with the things that I'm making. But what is optical size? Why do we care about this? It's something that we don't talk about as often as we talk about something like weight or width. And why do we call it optical size anyway? It's kind of a weird term. Why don't we call it the printed size or the physical size? And the thing is, when we look at the printed size, if we think about the printed size or the physical size, we're looking at the wrong thing. What we care about is what's going on in the reader's eye. How big does it seem to the reader? That's actually the important thing. And I think when we talk about optical size, that's what we're trying to suggest or point to. Because letters can be enormous, or they can be very tiny. This is actually 5-point, and this is the smallest I've been able to successfully design a typeface for. It's 5-point. But whatever physical size it is, again, it doesn't really matter. It's the question of how big is it in your eye. And the thing that mediates between the physical size and the size in the eye is distance. And so I made a little animation. There's a website. Let's see if we can get it to play. And this website is incredibly useful because in this example, we've got type, which is actually bigger than the observer's head. But what will happen in the animation is we'll pull this across. The type will get smaller and closer to the eye of the observer until it's very tiny indeed. But the size in the eye of the observer stays constant. And that's the point of this website, is that it allows you to do that kind of calculation for yourself. So if you're a maker of signs, or you have some other size-dependent situation where you're moving outside the realm of design for screen or design for a book, something that's held at a conventional distance, it lets you begin to calculate these things. And so this is the website, the font calculator website. And yeah, I don't know if we're going to have notes that are available after the conference where people can dig these things up. You're certainly welcome to be in contact with me, and I'll point you at these things. But I think this is an incredibly useful thing. And I actually used this website when I was working on a project for YouTube, because we had made a special typeface for the logo for YouTube, and then they had started to use the typeface in ways that it was not intended for outside of its optical size. They used it at concerts, and they put it up big in buildings, and it looked, so wrong. It was super bad. But I want to show you a basic proof that optical size is a real thing, because you may still be skeptical. and I'm hoping that this is going to work. And it's interesting that we have a room where we have people who are quite close to the screen and people way back at the far back. And your experience of these texts is going to be different. So what I'm going to show you is Halyard display, Halyard text, and Halyard micro. But we'll look at them instead of all together one at a time. So we've got, this is the display, and for people in the front, this is probably pretty comfortable. For people in the far back, probably not so much. And then this is text, probably people in the middle of the room, this is the most comfortable for them. And then in the far back, they'll still be able to read this, I have a feeling. And in the front, it may feel a little horsey and sort of strangely wide. So, but how do you make these adjustments? How do you do it? How do you make type optical anyway? So there's a number of elements that you can bring to bear as a sort of a menu of options that you can bring to the design in order to get an optical size. So you can change the spacing. This is Halyard again. And if we look at the way that it's spaced, we can see the word space gets much, much bigger as you go from display size down to a micro size. And similarly, the space between letters also changes. And that's enough to do a lot. And this is the original version of the YouTube lettering that we made. And then this is the special large size, optical size for YouTube. And you can see the same kind of thing is happening here. And so the little check mark in the corner is like, yes, use this one at 144 point. You also might want to change your X height. So in Halyard again, this is the display and the text and the micro, and it's going up. The X height is going up so that the counters inside of the lowercase become big enough to still see. There's also potentially you could change your joins. So again, in Halyard, we've got this quite thick join in the display because there's enough information. You don't need to thin the join as much. But as you get into smaller and smaller sizes, you need to emphasize that join and make sure that the join is seen differently. And towards the end, it's really a radically simplified shape. And this is also going on in the YouTube design. There's also a change in contrast, which is typical in optical size design. And if we look at old printed books, we can see that the larger type, you've got a very different feeling. And the smallest type, the ink, as it spreads out into the page, it makes things bulbous, it makes things grotesque. And so we can see that the thins in the large size are thinner, and the thins in the small size are comparatively thicker. The overall weight of the type is also going up for the small size. So in this design, we can see the grande is the largest one and the text is the smallest one in this particular set. And you can see that the texture of the type, and if you set words in it, the texture that you would get would be different as well. There's also a change in details of the treatment of details. So if we come back here again, we can see the serifs are extremely definite and sort of quite a specific shape in the large size. And in the small, it becomes a bit vague, a little brutal. And if we look at a digital typeface, which is having kind of the same visual intent as the printed example, we can see the same kind of thing is going on. If we blow this a little bigger, even though the smallest size, the serif has become brutal, it's still quite specific. But that specificity is probably going to disappear for the reader once it gets small. There's also a change in width, which is typical. And you can see that as I went from the small size was meant to be in the tiny corner of your web browser to something that was going to be enormous, I went ahead and I squeezed the letters together a little bit in order to give it the same feeling. So the whole idea here was that the experience you had, the brand that you had in the browser, and the little letters up in the corner, you should feel the same even though it's enormous. And to get the same feeling, I couldn't leave the letters as wide. I had to squeeze them. Here's another example of this kind of condensation at the top and then wider letters down at the bottom for small sizes. There's also potentially a change in roundness. So this is, it sort of looks distorted to me for a second. This is the halyard example again. And you can see it gets a little more boxy as it goes to the small size. And this is the typeface that I'm using in the presentation for titles. And you can see as it's going towards a smaller size, I'm using more of a super ellipse or boxier shape to the letters to allow the counters to stay bright. There's also a change in expression that's possible, or sort of an intensification of expression that's possible as you're heading into the larger sizes. It's kind of an opportunity. And so if we look at these printed letters, we can see that the amount of detail is increasing steadily. And if we look at the capitals, we can see that's where the increasing amount of detail is mostly occurring. But in the last two examples, the largest two, we can see we're even getting these little thin strokes coming out of the letters. And this, I think, increases the sense of personality quite a lot. So that's a real opportunity if we're designing for large sizes. This is a typeface called Swear from Ono Type Foundry. And we can see down at the bottom, the letter forms are quite a bit more conventional in proportion and in construction than at the top. And if we focus on the A's in particular and get close to them, we can see in the largest size, the expressivity of this A is more intense. The specificity or characteristicness of it is much, much greater, whereas the one at smaller sizes is more typical, more expected. And this is also happening in this letter W. And it goes so far as to get this more complicated structure at the largest size. Because now we have enough space for it, we can do it, we can be more intense. There's also, I was sent these things by David Jonathan Ross, and I thought they were really funny. And it's funny because you did something quite a lot like this, where you make a typeface and you keep all of the strokes the same thickness. And you can use optical size for that kind of trick as well. And then the other thing that David Jonathan Ross did is he made it so that if you use Warbler, you can't use it above a certain size. And so he made a little movie of someone trying to use it at a size that's not intended to be used at and being forced to stop at a certain point, which I thought was really funny, that he was going to no and sort of slap your hand and say, you mustn't use it at that size. That's not allowed. So that's kind of the menu of possibilities, or there may even be more, but these are the ones that I was finding. And so really the other thing is that no font style is necessarily exempt from being given an optical treatment necessarily. You know, one of my old type heroes, Joshua Darden, he made the Freight series, in a way a poster child for doing optical size design. Freight all the way from the big size all the way down to the tiny micro was a big influence on me as a younger type designer, even though I started quite late in life. And even though he made all of these incredible designs that are really different looking for each of the optical cuts of Freight, when he made his Freight Sans, he just made one optical size. And I always found that terribly disappointing. So I think that's the reason why I made this slide. So from how you do it, we could also ask, you know, sort of why would you do it? And so this is my fundamental thesis, is that if you've got a typeface and it isn't being used at its correct optical size, there's a kind of a compromise. And I make this analogy to a shoe fitting. If your typeface fits the optical need, it's like having the right size shoe on. Oh, okay. And so, you know, that's an argument that has to do with comfort. And I think comfort is really important. It's not to be discounted. It's not a minor thing. And particularly if you've got a system that a lot of people are exposed to for maybe, you know, years and years of their lives in a city or even in a country, or if you've got a long form piece of text that somebody has to really spend time with, it makes sense to think about comfort and to maximize it. But there's also the question of safety. You know, I saw this and I thought, is somebody really going to pay attention to this message and stay safe? I don't know. And then there's this kind of thing on the back of a pill bottle. I don't think you can justify this typographic choice. This doesn't seem like safety is the most important question. You know, somebody's health is probably going to get not dealt with optimally because of a typographic choice. So I think there are situations where a sensitive typographic treatment could make the difference between a positive or a negative outcome, maybe even death of someone. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the fact that optical as a name for the thing that we're talking about is kind of a weird term. If we talk about weight, we all know what this is. It's easy. It's not really a question. If we talk about width, we also understand this. It's sort of easy. But if we talk about optical, it's different. What do we mean by it? It's uncomfortable a little bit. And there's some reasons for that. So when we talk about optical, we sort of think, is it a lens? You know, is that the association? But it's not. It's really about human perception. And so, unfortunately, we're sort of stuck with this name. There's nothing really that we can do about it as far as I can see. Maybe we'll change our culture, but I suspect we'll be stuck with this name. The other thing is that the style names that we give to our optical sizes are also kind of weird and uncomfortable. So, for example, you'll use display and banner headline. This is sort of a subset of all of the many possible names that people have given to optical sizes. And it makes sort of sense that we use these things. We're sort of alluding to the optical nature in using them, but they're sort of indirect. And if we use those names and we put them into font styles, this is Kepler, it has 146 styles. It becomes a little unwieldy to use. I don't know about you, but I'm not excited about seeing 146 options in my list of fonts. Google has a different approach to it. They say, you know, just give it a point name, and it's just a number. And so what you do is you get your style names, and if you've got a weight, it's going to be reflected here, but the width and the optical size are only on sliders. And that's what you could argue that this is better, and I think it's better in some ways, but it also seems like a little uncomfortable too, because you have to go find that in order to use it. There's also this weird history that we have with optical sizes as a typographic community that I think is worth kind of pointing out, which is that, and I want to talk about the way that we conventionally choose types. We'll mostly say, okay, for the large type, that's where we're going to get our personality from. Let's pick this one. This is owner's design, by the way, in the display. And then we'll slap a text underneath it, and we'll get enough contrast. We'll find a relationship between these two things that we like. And as long as these relationships are okay, what we're really saying is the top one is a large optical size and the bottom is a text size. But we're not thinking about it in those terms. We're not thinking about it as optical, we're just going, oh, that's a text font. Oh, that's a display font. And so we're not consciously thinking of it as optical size when we're making those choices. But if we go back into old books like this and look inside, we can see that we formerly were making things as a craft when we're making letters, where the 1G is optimized for its position or its size, its use, and then the other G is optimized for its use. And we got away from that craft of making letters in that way and punching them out like that. And we held that craft right up until the dawn of hot metal, and then we got rid of it. We got rid of it for reasons of money and speed. In the old way, we had font designs that were more or less optimized for size, but we had some problems. You could only have specific sizes of type and just the ones that you had copies of. And it was very slow and very expensive. And so then we get this break. And the break occurs with the new. The new, we get font sizes and designs that are not matched to optical size, but you can have any size you want, and you can have it fast, and you can have it cheap. And this is progress of a kind. And the way that we made this jump is with phototype, and we would cut out our letters in incredible detail and Rubylith, and then we would get them onto a disk like this, or there are other kinds of phototype systems, and we would expose the letters using light. Now we're not creating letters with ink anymore, necessarily, and we're not with lead and metal, but with light. It's pretty cool. And we're making individual drawings, and we're bringing these drawings into a digital form. And in this process of going to phototype, we lose the relationship with optical, because the phototype and the digital forms that are initially made, none of them are optical. They're all a kind of compromise. Like, where in the series of drawings is the best compromise? We're going to make the compromise and just have one style, one optical size for a family. And this is the kind of tool that we use to create this. You probably used a tool like that, right? Yeah. So that's the origin of the break with optical size that we're sort of recovering now. There's also a biology question in optical size. So if you go to the optometrist, you might see this kind of thing. And down here at the bottom, that's where 20/20 vision is. And so if we look at the shape of the E, you can say it's going this way, back up, over again. And the optometrist is going to say, what can you see? And he's going to use lenses to simulate for that line standing 20 feet away from the sign. And so that's 20/20 vision if you can make out row 6. And so the middle portion of the E is the point, sort of the limit of typical human acuity, the place where you can make out which direction is it going, and the fact that there's even a line in the middle. So, but what's going on inside the eye? How is this human acuity? Let's look inside. If we look inside the eye, we have the light coming through the iris, going through the lens, and finally hitting the back of the retina and getting sensed. Back in the retina, if we kind of zoom into it, that's where, in that tiny little dip, way back there, that tiny little shape, we zoom in, that's where the human acuity is occurring. And that line being the determinant of acuity. And if we were eagles, we wouldn't need optical size fonts, because eagles have 8 times the acuity of a human being. It's only the fact that our eyes are as weak as they are that we actually need these things. But we are human beings, we do have weak eyes, and we do need optical fonts. And so this is showing at the center of, this is kind of a computer interpretation of the rods and cones inside the eye. And these are the cones, the rods and cones that are for sensing green light and red light and blue light. It's kind of interesting in the middle, it's all just red and green. And this is a simulation of the eye trying to sense this test. And you can see that there's the number of cells available at 2020 to detect that middle part of the E is actually pretty small. It's pretty gross, the relationship of the number of cells being used to the shape that's being sensed. And that's why the limitation exists. Before I was going to do this talk, I thought, okay, I should look into like what is the most recent information about this, and I found Eric van Blockland talked about Austin Ruda's work, and this is the URL for Austin's lab at Berkeley in California. And in his talk, he points out that we're not really talking about these letters as we see these 2020 letters that are clear here on the left. We're really talking about something that's much more like that. Because by the time the light goes through your lens and actually hits your retina, it's become pretty vague. And Ruda is showing us that that's the case. This is what we were thinking of as the letter, and that's kind of what the retina's getting. And what's happening is, as the retina receives this data, it's interpreting it. And the eye is moving around, it's kind of jittering, as building up enough data that it's building up the impression of the E at the limits of our acuity. And so if we superimpose the size of this is just my illustration, it's not terribly precise, but if we simulate the size of the individual cells at the limit of human acuity, and we align them up just right, we can kind of see where we would potentially be able to sense that middle part of the E. And it's easier to see here, of course, because the E is very bright and sharp, but it's over there on the far side that's a little closer to the reality. There's also the question of separating two letters, one from the other, distinguishing this is one letter, over here is another letter. And if we have our letters too close together at the limits of human acuity, it doesn't work. But if we separate them a little bit, then it works better. You need enough space. And if we look at Halyard Micro, we can see that it's actually kind of corresponds nicely to this. And it's meant to be used at the limits of human acuity. But I didn't know about the cells before I made Halyard Micro. I just was testing. And the same kind of thing applies to signs that are for driving. You want to have enough space so you can read it from far away. And if we double the number, and this I actually made this slide after I had a conversation with you, Albert. If we double the number of cells, then we're in much safer place, much more comfortable place. Now we're not at the limits of human acuity. And that's not supposed to be there. And yeah, if we get into text size and Halyard, it's closer to that doubling. And I think it would be irresponsible of me not to point out that this book, Size-Specific Adjustments to Type Designs, exists. Tim Ahrens wrote this book, and it's an amazing resource. So if you're interested in the question of optical type designs and want to go deeper with it, this is a great resource. I absolutely recommend it. So thanks very much.